1877. New York City, January 8th. The winter sky hangs gray over Washington Place, where brownstone facades line the street in rigid symmetry. Inside number 10, Cornelius Vanderbilt dies at age 82 in his townhouse, his body finally surrendering after months of declining health. The house itself is modest by the standards he could afford: 4 stories of brick and stone, functional rather than ostentatious, located in a neighborhood already being eclipsed by the northward march of Manhattan's wealth. He leaves behind $100 million more money than existed in the United States Treasury, more wealth than had ever been accumulated by a single individual in human history up to that point. His empire of railroads and shipping lines had consumed competitors like a slow-moving industrial fire, leaving him richer than anyone in American history. The funeral was enormous, a spectacle of industrial-age power staged along Fifth Avenue. Thousands lined the streets between buildings still raw with construction dust from the city's explosive growth. Business leaders, politicians, and ordinary workers came to witness the passing of an era. The New York Central Railroad, his crown jewel, draped locomotives in black crepe at Grand Central Depot, where iron and steam had replaced the horse-drawn omnibuses of his youth. Yet within 70 years, his descendants would gather at Vanderbilt University for a family reunion and discover that not one among them qualified as a millionaire by the standards of that time. The wealthiest family in America had evaporated into statistical ordinariness. This is not a story about bad luck or economic forces beyond human control. This is a story about the architecture of wealth, the psychology of inheritance, and the invisible systems that destroyed what seemed permanent. The Vanderbilts did not lose their fortune through market crashes or bad investments alone. They executed it with mathematical precision, generation by generation, choice by choice. The Commodore, as Cornelius was universally known, built his empire through strategies that would be illegal today and were barely legal then. He began with a single ferry boat at age 16, purchased with a $100 loan from his mother. The boat ran between Staten Island and Manhattan, competing against established operators who charged 25 cents per passenger. Cornelius charged 18 cents, operating at a loss subsidized by his own labor. He worked 20-hour days, 7 days a week, maintaining the vessel himself, navigating in weather that kept other boats docked. His method was simple: undercut every competitor on price until they sold to him or went bankrupt, then raise prices to monopolistic levels once competition was eliminated. He moved from ferries to steamships, from coastal routes to transatlantic lines, accumulating vessels through intimidation, political bribery, and strategic brutality. When rivals tried to compete, he launched rate wars that destroyed their capital while his reserves absorbed the losses. During one particularly vicious competition with the Collins Line for transatlantic shipping supremacy, Vanderbilt cut fares so low that both companies operated at staggering losses for months. The Collins Line, backed by federal mail subsidies, eventually collapsed when those subsidies were withdrawn after Vanderbilt's lobbying in Washington. When the California gold rush created demand for Atlantic to Pacific transportation, he built a route through Nicaragua that was shorter than the established Panama route, undercutting competitors until he controlled hemispheric traffic. He also pioneered corporate warfare tactics, buying small amounts of competitor stock, attending shareholder meetings, and causing chaos that depressed stock prices so he could buy controlling interest cheaply. By the Civil War, he had transitioned to railroads, applying the same ruthless consolidation. His philosophy was expressed in a single line he repeated throughout his life, variations of which appeared in multiple accounts. Law? What do I care about law? Ain't I got the power? He understood that in the Industrial Revolution's early chaos, wealth flowed to those willing to use violence, legal, economic, and occasionally physical through hired enforcers without hesitation or moral reservation. By his death, he controlled the New York Central Railroad and much of America's northeastern transportation infrastructure. He had built an empire that required constant warfare to maintain. The moment aggression stopped, entropy would begin. The will was a weapon disguised as inheritance, designed to concentrate rather than distribute. Cornelius left $95 million to his eldest son, William Henry Vanderbilt, bypassing his other 8 children almost entirely. The reading of the will created immediate family warfare. Daughters received between $250,000 and $500,000 each, substantial sums that would make them wealthy by ordinary standards, but insulting fractions of the whole that represented less than 0.5% of the estate. Younger sons received similar amounts, just enough to feel the sting of exclusion while watching their older brother inherit an empire. Cornelius Jeremiah, the Commodore's second son who had struggled with epilepsy and gambling addiction throughout his life, received only the income from a $200,000 trust, with the principal held permanently out of reach, a final insult from a father who had called him worthless. 2 years after the Commodore's death, Cornelius Jeremiah would commit suicide, shooting himself in a New York hotel room, leaving a note that blamed his father's treatment. The reasoning for the concentrated inheritance was coldly practical and publicly stated in the will's language. Divide the fortune and it weakens into irrelevance. Concentrated, and perhaps one son could hold the empire together against competitors and economic forces. William Henry was not chosen for brilliance or vision. The Commodore had spent decades calling him a fool and incompetent. He was chosen because he had shown the most tolerance for his father's contempt during decades of being called a failure, because he had endured grinding work without breaking, because he had proven he could survive humiliation and still function. The Commodore had forced him to work managing a failing Staten Island farm in the 1840s, then later managing railroad operations, when the old man finally acknowledged his son had some capability. William Henry proved himself through decades of grinding operational work while his father insulted him publicly and privately. The inheritance was not a gift or an honor. It was a test the Commodore expected would be failed, a challenge issued from beyond the grave to a son he had never respected. William Henry surprised everyone, including his father's ghost, by doubling the fortune within 9 years through systematic competence rather than the Commodore's chaotic aggression. Where the Commodore had been a strategic pirate, William Henry was a methodical manager. He consolidated competing lines, improved operational efficiency, invested heavily in steel rails and modern equipment, including Westinghouse air brakes, and demonstrated that wealth could grow through systematic competence. By 1885, the fortune had reached $194 million, the equivalent of roughly $92 billion in contemporary purchasing power. But William Henry had no interest in dynasty building. When a reporter asked whether he ran his railroads for the public good, he replied, "The public be damned. I'm working for my stockholders." He was accumulating wealth without purpose, beyond accumulation itself, creating a fortune with no institutional structure to preserve it across generations. William Henry had doubled the wealth but created no system to protect it from the entropy of generational succession. The explosion began the moment William Henry died in 1885. 8 children divided $194 million, still an incomprehensible sum, but now fragmented across multiple households, multiple temperaments, multiple marriages. The psychological shift was immediate and catastrophic. Where the Commodore had been shaped by poverty and scarcity, raised in a household that struggled, William Henry had been shaped by skepticism and his father's contempt, but at least understood the mechanisms of wealth generation. This third generation, the Commodore's grandchildren, had known only abundance from birth. They understood wealth as a birthright rather than an achievement, a static inheritance rather than a dynamic war requiring constant attention. Money appeared in their accounts. Managers handled investments. Businesses operated through intermediaries. The connection between effort and reward had been severed completely. And so they did what trust fund heirs throughout history have done when separated from the source of their wealth. They turned money into spectacle, capital into performance, economic power into social visibility. The Gilded Age was beginning, and the Vanderbilts would become its most visible symbols, its most enthusiastic performers, building monuments to their own temporary existence. Alva Vanderbilt understood that in the absence of political power, the Vanderbilts had wealth, but no office, no title, no formal authority in government. Social dominance becomes the substitute arena for ambition. She had married William Kissam Vanderbilt, one of William Henry's sons, in 1875. Alva was not born into wealth. Her father had lost his cotton fortune in the Civil War, and she had grown up understanding social position as something that must be fought for rather than assumed as birthright. Where the Vanderbilts born into money were complacent about their position, Alva was strategic and aggressive. She immediately identified the central problem. Despite their staggering wealth, the Vanderbilts were still considered nouveau riche by New York's old money aristocracy, the Astors and their social circle who had been established for generations. Caroline Astor, the self-appointed queen of New York society, who determined who was acceptable and who was not, had never acknowledged the Vanderbilts as social equals. Her famous ballroom held exactly 400 people, and the Vanderbilts were not among them. Alva decided to force recognition through overwhelming architectural spectacle that could not be ignored. In 1883, she built a French chateau at 665th Avenue for $3 million, $60 million in contemporary terms. The building rose 5 stories on the corner of 52nd Street. Its limestone facade carved with gargoyles, turrets, and Gothic details copied directly from the Château de Blois in the Loire Valley. Richard Morris Hunt designed it in the style of François I, with steep slate roofs, dormer windows, and elaborate chimneys that seemed transported from 16th-century France to the grid of Manhattan. The entrance hall soared 2 stories, paneled in cane stone, with a grand staircase of carved cane stone rising under stained glass windows imported from a dismantled French abbey. The ballroom stretched 60 feet, its walls covered in gilded boiserie panels, the ceiling painted with allegorical figures representing the arts. Crystal chandeliers hung on bronze chains. The floors were inlaid parquet in geometric patterns. Every room announced not just wealth, but European cultural legitimacy. The library held rare books in leather bindings. The dining room featured Flemish tapestries. The morning room displayed Sèvres porcelain in specially built cases. Then she threw a costume ball in the space that became the defining social event of the decade, perhaps of the entire Gilded Age. 1,200 guests invited, deliberately more than could fit in Caroline Astor's ballroom. Quadrille dances choreographed for months in advance, with prominent New York families practicing elaborate routines. Costumes costing individual fortunes. Designed by theater professionals and European couturiers, some guests spent $5,000 on a single costume, equivalent to years of wages for working families. The ballroom was decorated to resemble a European palace, with electric lights still a novelty that required a private generator in the basement, illuminating thousands of roses and orchids arranged in massive displays. Alva sent invitations to everyone who mattered in New York society, except Caroline Astor, deliberately excluding the woman whose approval she sought. Astor's daughter Carrie desperately wanted to attend and had been practicing a quadrille with her friends. The older woman was forced to break her own rule, personally calling on Alva at the chateau to request an invitation, thereby formally acknowledging the Vanderbilts as social equals worthy of respect. The strategy worked perfectly. The ball cost a fortune, but it purchased social supremacy. Newspapers covered it for weeks, describing the costumes and the house in obsessive detail. But Alva had confused a successful battle with a won war. She had secured social position by spending capital rather than generating it, by consuming wealth rather than deploying it productively in businesses or investments. She had established a template that would bankrupt the family, turn money into spectacle, spectacle into status, status into more spending, to maintain position in an endless cycle of consumption. The chateau itself became a prison of expectations, requiring constant maintenance, constant staffing, constant performance. The mansions multiplied like a virus of vanity, each one more extravagant than the last, transforming the American landscape into a gallery of European fantasy. The breakers in Newport, Rhode Island, Cornelius Vanderbilt II, commissioned Richard Morris Hunt to create a 70-room Italian Renaissance palace on the cliffs overlooking the Atlantic. The location itself was theatrical. 11 acres on Ochre Point, where the lawn ended in a sudden drop to rocks and crashing surf 40 feet below. The house faced the ocean with a limestone facade modeled after 16th-century Genoese palaces, its walls rising 4 stories with loggias, balconies, and elaborate cornices. $5 million to build, finished in 1895 after 2 years of construction that employed hundreds of craftsmen. The house was designed to be used 8 weeks per year during the summer social season, yet its scale suggested permanent habitation. The entrance hall set the tone 45 feet high, the walls covered in cane limestone, carved with classical motifs, the ceiling painted with allegorical figures representing architecture and the arts. A double staircase rose along the walls, each step carved from single blocks of marble. The great hall beyond was the house's center, 50 feet by 50 feet, rising 2 stories under a coffered ceiling covered in 22-karat gold leaf and platinum. The walls were clad in rare marble rosé from Algeria, Cipollino from Italy, arranged in geometric patterns. 4 massive fireplaces anchored the space, their mantels carved from single blocks of stone. The dining room could seat 34 at a table positioned under twin crystal chandeliers, the walls covered in panels of red Numidian marble quarried in North Africa, the ceiling painted to resemble an open sky with trailing vines. The music room featured platinum leaf on the ceiling and walls of carved oak inlaid with mother-of-pearl. Bathrooms, revolutionary for their time, featured hot and cold running salt water and fresh water, marble tubs, and fixtures imported from Europe. The house required permanent staff of 30 people, year-round maids, groundskeepers, footmen, cooks, maintenance workers, electricians, just to maintain the illusion of effortless elegance, increasing to 60 during the social season when the family was in residence. Their quarters were hidden in a separate wing and underground tunnels so that servants could move through the house without being seen by guests. The kitchen was isolated in a separate building connected by an underground passage to keep cooking smells away from the main house. Marble House, completed in 1892, was another Alva production, built while she was still married to William Kissam Vanderbilt on Bellevue Avenue in Newport. $11 million in contemporary terms. The architectural concept was purer than the Breakers, a direct copy of the Petit Trianon at Versailles, reduced slightly in scale, but intensified in material luxury. The exterior was white marble throughout, no brick or wood. The facade, a perfect essay in 18th-century French classicism with columns, pilasters, and a central pediment. Inside, the ballroom featured walls of yellow marble from Siena, the stone, chosen for its color rather than structural necessity, cut and polished until it glowed. The carved wooden doors were covered in gold leaf. The Gothic room contained medieval architectural elements purchased from dismantled European estates and reassembled: a fireplace from a French chateau, carved panels from an English manor house, stained glass from a German monastery. The Chinese tea house stood separate from the main building at the edge of the property overlooking the ocean, its walls covered in elaborate carvings and paintings, a folly built at enormous expense for occasional afternoon gatherings. Alva claimed she built Marble House to prove her superiority in architectural taste over Caroline Astor, who lived nearby in a mansion Alva considered inferior. The house was a weapon in an argument about aesthetics, a statement made in stone and gold. Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina, George Washington Vanderbilt's attempt to create a European-style country seat in the American South, the largest private residence ever built in the United States, set in landscape that seemed designed by nature to accommodate such ambition. The site sat in a valley of the Blue Ridge Mountains, where the French Broad River curved through forests that turned gold and crimson in autumn. George purchased 125,000 acres, nearly 200 square miles of mountain land, much of it cut over and eroded from previous logging, which he intended to restore while creating his estate. Construction began in 1889 and continued for 6 years, requiring a workforce of 1,000 laborers at its peak, many housed in a temporary village built specifically for the project. 250 rooms, 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, 65 fireplaces, each with a unique carved mantel, 4 acres of floor space under a single roof. The scale was incomprehensible even by Vanderbilt standards. The house was designed by Richard Morris Hunt in the style of a French Renaissance chateau, modeled specifically after chateaux in the Loire Valley, particularly Blois and Chambord. The building measured over 4 acres of floor space, its exterior Indiana limestone shipped by rail, the facade stretching 780 feet along the front, with steeply pitched slate roofs, elaborate chimneys clustered at intervals, dormer windows projecting from the roof line, and a tower rising higher than the rest to provide views across the valley to distant mountain ridges. The approach was carefully orchestrated, a 3-mile drive through planted forest, designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, winding upward through carefully arranged trees until the house suddenly appeared, positioned to seem even larger than its actual massive scale. The entrance was through a winter garden conservatory filled with palms and tropical plants maintained year-round by a dedicated staff, creating immediate sense of entering another world disconnected from the mountain forests outside. Inside, the banquet hall rose 70 feet to a barrel-vaulted ceiling of oak, with a fireplace large enough to burn 8-foot logs. The mantel carved with Renaissance-style figures and coats of arms. Flemish tapestries covered the walls. The library held 22,000 volumes on 2 levels, connected by a spiral staircase, the ceiling painted with allegorical figures representing literature and learning, most books never read. The estate grounds were a separate achievement. Olmsted designed not just gardens, but an entire managed landscape, including the approach forest, a 400-acre formal garden with Italian, English, and French sections, a walled garden for vegetables, greenhouses for orchids and tropical plants, a deer park, a bass pond, and managed forests using the latest European forestry techniques under Gifford Pinchot's direction. George had created not just a house, but an entire self-contained world, a bubble of European aristocratic life transported to the North Carolina mountains. The construction costs were catastrophic, consuming vast portions of George's inheritance. Estimates suggest $10 million in contemporary terms, an almost unimaginable sum for a private residence. But George convinced himself he was building legacy rather than burning capital, creating an American equivalent of a European great house that would stand for centuries and establish the Vanderbilt name as permanent American aristocracy. He filled Biltmore with art and rare books purchased from European collections, creating an intellectual retreat that almost nobody visited. He installed modern technology, electricity powered by a private generating station, indoor plumbing with both hot and cold water, central heating via steam radiators, an indoor swimming pool in the basement with underwater lighting, a bowling alley, a gymnasium. The house had its own dairy with prize cattle, its own forestry operations, its own brick factory, and woodworking shops. But the estate was isolated in the North Carolina mountains, hours by train from any major city, which meant almost nobody visited. George lived there with his wife and daughter in splendid isolation, maintaining a palace-scale establishment for an audience that barely existed. The building was beautiful. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. It was also economically insane, generating no income while requiring massive ongoing expenditure that would drain the family fortune for generations. The psychology of mansion building reveals the core pathology that destroyed the Vanderbilts across all their decisions. Each heir watched siblings and cousins construct monuments and felt competitive pressure to match or exceed them, driven by sibling rivalry elevated to the scale of industrial fortunes. Status was relative, measured by comparison rather than absolute terms or objective utility. If your brother built a 50-room cottage in Newport, you needed 60 rooms to maintain relative position. If your sister threw a ball for 1,000 guests, you needed 1,200 to demonstrate equal or superior social standing. If your cousin spent $3 million on a house, you needed to spend $4 million to avoid appearing less successful. The competition was fratricidal. Without being conscious, each participant believed they were simply claiming their rightful place while actually destroying the shared foundation beneath all of them. Nobody saw themselves as competing. They saw themselves as maintaining appropriate dignity. The mansions were not homes in any meaningful sense of shelter or family gathering. They were advertisements of wealth that announced to the world, and crucially to fortune hunters, social climbers, and vendors of luxury goods, exactly which families had money to extract. They were targets painted on the backs of heirs. The buildings created expectations about lifestyle that became self-perpetuating and self-amplifying. Once you owned the breakers, you could not appear at social events in last season's fashion or last decade's jewels without provoking speculation. The mansion set a baseline of display that had to be maintained constantly or risk public speculation about financial trouble, which could become self-fulfilling as creditors and investors lost confidence. The houses trapped their owners in escalating performance that consumed ever larger portions of capital. The maintenance costs alone were ruinous, turning architecture into ongoing hemorrhage that consumed wealth faster than most investments could generate returns. The breakers required that permanent staff of 30 people, maids, groundskeepers, footmen, cooks, maintenance workers, electricians, year-round, despite being used only in summer for perhaps 8 to 10 weeks. Their salaries, housing, food, uniforms, and management infrastructure consumed tens of thousands of dollars annually in an era when that represented genuine wealth. The house needed year-round heating to prevent damage to art, furnishings, and the structure itself from dampness and temperature fluctuations. Despite being unoccupied for 10 months, repairs to marble, gilding, and decorative elements required specialists brought from Europe or trained in European techniques. The cost of maintaining gold leaf alone ran to thousands annually. Marble House needed similar year-round maintenance for rooms used perhaps 60 days per year during the Newport social season. The gold bathroom fixtures required constant polishing to maintain appearance. The sienna marble required specialized treatment to prevent deterioration from salt air. The elaborate systems needed inspection and maintenance regardless of use. Biltmore was catastrophically worse in its demands. The property employed hundreds of people as gardeners, foresters, craftsmen, electricians, plumbers, and servants to maintain George Vanderbilt's fantasy of European aristocracy on American soil. The estate generated no income whatsoever. The forests were managed as idealistic conservation projects rather than commercial timber operations that might have offset costs. The farms were experimental rather than profitable. George had created a money-consuming organism that required constant feeding, a financial black hole disguised as an estate. These properties were not investments in any traditional sense that generated returns or appreciated in value relative to costs. They were ongoing catastrophes disguised as assets, beautiful disasters that consumed capital every year they stood simply to prevent deterioration. Each mansion represented millions of dollars that could have been deployed in railroad expansion, industrial investment, emerging technologies, or even conservative financial instruments, generating 5 to 10% annual returns. Instead, that capital was transformed into stone, marble, and gold leaf. The marriages accelerated the dissolution, creating a transatlantic flow of capital out of the family system. Vanderbilt daughters and granddaughters became prizes in an aristocratic market, trading American money for European titles in transactions that would have been called prostitution if conducted less formally. Consuelo Vanderbilt, daughter of William Kissam Vanderbilt and Alva, was forced by her mother into marriage with Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, in 1895. Consuelo was 18 years old and in love with Winthrop Rutherford, an American she had been seeing secretly. The Duke was 23 and needed money desperately to save Blenheim Palace from ruin. The estate was encumbered with debt, the roof was leaking, and the family faced financial collapse without an infusion of capital. Alva wanted a duchess for a daughter and saw the marriage as the ultimate social achievement. She locked Consuelo in her room, threatened to kill herself if the marriage did not proceed, and broke her daughter's will through psychological warfare that bordered on abuse. The marriage settlement included $2.5 million in railroad stock, transferred directly to the Duke, with an additional $100,000 annual income for life. The wedding at St. Thomas Church in New York was attended by 2,000 guests and covered by newspapers internationally. The marriage was loveless from the start and psychologically abusive throughout its duration. Consuelo later wrote in her autobiography about being a prisoner in a gilded cage, about the Duke's contempt for Americans and his interest only in her money, about the separate bedrooms and separate lives they maintained. The couple separated after 11 years, having produced 2 sons who secured the succession, and eventually divorced after a protracted legal battle that required additional financial settlements. But the title had been secured, and Alva considered this a victory worth any price, worth her daughter's happiness, worth millions of dollars. The Vanderbilt fortune had purchased a dukedom and saved a British palace, with American money flowing permanently out of the family system into British estates and aristocratic maintenance. This pattern repeated across the family through the early 20th century. Gladys Vanderbilt married a Hungarian count. Gertrude Vanderbilt married Harry Payne Whitney, consolidating 2 American fortunes but then spending lavishly on art collecting and patronage that consumed rather than preserved capital. Each aristocratic marriage represented wealth flowing outward, never to return. The Vanderbilts were subsidizing the decline of European aristocracy with their own fortune, purchasing titles that meant nothing in Republican America and dignity that could not pay bills or generate income. The men fared no better, perhaps worse. Divorces became common by the early 20th century, and each dissolution came with ruinous financial settlements in an era without prenuptial agreements protecting fortunes. Alva herself divorced William Kissam Vanderbilt in 1895, extracting millions in what was then an unprecedented settlement for a woman leaving a marriage. She had been caught in an affair. By traditional morality was at fault, but she leveraged her knowledge of William's own affairs to secure enormous compensation. She immediately married Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont and spent his fortune building another mansion. The family had no institutional memory of protecting wealth through marriage law. They had too much money for prenuptial agreements to seem necessary, and too much pride to admit vulnerability to fortune hunters. Each divorce was an amputation of capital. Each remarriage cost more new houses, new gifts, new social position building to establish the new spouse. The fortune was being distributed to ex-spouses, divorce lawyers, and fortune hunters, while the Vanderbilts themselves maintained the public fiction of endless wealth. The newspapers covered their parties and mansions. The public saw only glamour. Behind the performance, accountants were watching assets disappear. The business acumen evaporated completely within 2 generations. Where the Commodore had lived for competition and William Henry had understood railroad operations, their grandchildren saw business as something managers handled while they handled leisure. Boards of directors made decisions. Investments were passive. The psychological shift was complete from builders to spenders, from operators to owners. When economic conditions shifted, when new industries emerged to challenge railroad dominance, the Vanderbilts had no mechanism to adapt. They attended board meetings, but did not understand the businesses. They hired advisors, but could not evaluate advice. They were wealthy in assets, but poor in the capabilities that had generated those assets. The taxation hammer fell in 1916 with the introduction of federal estate taxes, then accelerated dramatically during the New Deal, when rates reached 70% for the largest estates by the mid-1930s. The Revenue Act of 1916 established a top rate of 10% on estates over $5 million, relatively modest by later standards, but unprecedented in American history and philosophically revolutionary. The concept that government could take a portion of inherited wealth simply for the act of inheritance was new and controversial. By 1935, the top rate had been increased to 70% on estates over $50 million, with the explicit and publicly stated goal of preventing dynastic wealth accumulation across generations. President Franklin Roosevelt argued that concentrated wealth threatened democracy itself, that inherited fortunes created an aristocracy incompatible with American ideals. The Vanderbilts had structured their wealth for a world without estate taxes, a world that had existed for the entire century-long history of their fortune building. Assets were held in personal names rather than trusts designed to minimize tax exposure. Wealth was concentrated in real estate, mansions, art collections, and personal property rather than liquid securities that could be efficiently transferred or divided. Each generational transfer now meant a forced liquidation to pay the government within 9 months of death. Mansions had to be sold at fire sale prices because there were few buyers who could afford properties of that scale, and because the sales had to happen quickly to generate tax payment cash. Art collections were auctioned, often at depressed prices because the market knew the sales were forced and could wait for desperate pricing. Railroad shares were dumped onto markets that could not absorb them at full value, depressing prices further and creating losses beyond the tax burden itself. The tax system was designed explicitly by progressive reformers to prevent the creation of permanent aristocracy, to force redistribution of concentrated wealth back into the broader economy, and it worked exactly as intended against families like the Vanderbilts. But the Vanderbilts accelerated their own destruction by maintaining the spending patterns of the tax-free era, even as the game's fundamental rules had changed permanently. They still built mansions in the 1920s. They still threw elaborate parties costing hundreds of thousands. They still married expensively and divorced expensively. They were operating with a mental model of wealth from 1880 while living in 1930, unable or unwilling to adapt their psychology to match new reality. The disconnect was total and fatal to the dynasty. The Great Depression exposed the systemic fragility that had been hidden by rising markets and easy credit during the 1920s boom. Suddenly, mansions became impossible to maintain as servants disappeared into unemployment lines or demanded wages the families could no longer justify paying when their own asset values were collapsing. The elaborate household staffs that had made grand living possible simply evaporated. At the breakers, the 50 by 50-foot Great Hall, with its gold-leafed ceiling, stood empty for months at a time. The marble floors uncleaned, the fireplaces cold, the elaborate heating systems that had consumed coal by the ton sat idle because the cost could not be justified. Newport's Bellevue Avenue, once lined with occupied mansions ablaze with light during the season, went dark house by house as families closed properties they could no longer afford to open. Property taxes remained fixed or even increased as desperate municipalities tried to maintain revenue, even as asset values collapsed by 80% or more between 1929 and 1933. Assessors still valued the breakers at millions despite there being no market for such properties. The stock market crash of October 1929 destroyed paper wealth across America, wiping out $40 billion in market value within weeks, but it destroyed Vanderbilt wealth, especially because so much of it existed in the form of illiquid real estate, art, and personal property, rather than productive business that could adapt to changing conditions. A Sienna marble ballroom could not be quickly converted to cash. The family had optimized for social visibility rather than economic resilience, for consumption rather than production. When visibility became expensive and resilience became necessary, they had neither the capital nor the capabilities to adapt. The mansions that had announced their wealth now announced their decline in humiliating public spectacle. For sale signs appeared on properties that had been built to last centuries and house generations, an admission of failure visible to anyone walking past. The physical decay was rapid once maintenance stopped. Salt air corroded the gilding at Marble House. Roof leaks appeared at properties where no one was watching. Gardens went wild, the elaborate plantings overtaken by weeds. Lawns turned brown. The Breakers was nearly sold for demolition in the early 1930s, saved only by family members pooling resources to donate it to the Preservation Society of Newport County for a tax deduction, the house escaping destruction by months. Marble House became a museum. Biltmore Estate, too large to sell and too expensive to abandon, was opened to paying tourists in 1930 to generate revenue for basic maintenance, transforming from private palace to commercial attraction within a generation. George Vanderbilt's widow and daughter could not afford to maintain the property on their reduced income, could not heat all 250 rooms, could not staff the house as it had been designed to be staffed. Wings were closed off. Sheets covered furniture. The elaborate systems installed at such cost, the indoor pool, the bowling alley, the gymnasium sat unused because operating them cost more than the family could spare. The transformation from private palaces to public museums began not as planned legacy or philanthropic gesture, but as desperate expedient to avoid complete loss and demolition. The final ironic twist came in 1973 when 120 Vanderbilt descendants gathered at Vanderbilt University itself, a monument to the Commodore's late-life philanthropic guilt. A $45 million endowment he had given in 1873, partly for legacy and partly for tax advantages, and discovered that not one among them qualified as a millionaire in personal wealth. The fortune that had been the largest in American history had been thoroughly distributed, spent, taxed, divorced away, and simply consumed across 4 generations. Some descendants lived comfortably on trust funds that provided middle-class incomes. Some lived ordinarily, working regular jobs as teachers, middle managers, small business owners. Some lived poorly, struggling with debt. The family name remained famous, a shorthand for Gilded Age excess. But the family wealth had returned to statistical mean. 3 generations from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves, the old saying goes. The Vanderbilts had executed the pattern with almost mathematical precision, compressing what usually takes dynasties centuries into less than 100 years. But framing this as mere profligacy misses the deeper architectural failure. The Vanderbilt fortune was destroyed by a fundamental misunderstanding of what wealth is at that scale. The Commodore had built an empire through monopolistic violence in an era when such violence was legal and rewarded, when government was weak and regulation barely existed. That historical window was already closing when he died. His fortune was not perpetual motion, it was the frozen moment of a specific era's opportunities. William Henry briefly extended it through competent management, but his children inherited wealth in an era transforming toward regulated capitalism, progressive taxation, and professionalized management. They tried to live like feudal aristocrats in an emerging corporate democracy. The mismatch was total. The mansions themselves serve as perfect metaphors for the underlying pathology. Each one represented an attempt to transform liquid capital into permanent legacy, to convert the temporary advantage of wealth into the permanent statement of a great house that would stand for centuries. But houses are not legacy in any meaningful sense. They are maintenance obligations that consume wealth annually. Legacy is institutional universities that operate independently, companies that grow beyond founder control, foundations that deploy capital toward purposes. The Vanderbilts built houses instead of institutions, confusing visibility with permanence, confusing the monument with the thing being memorialized. When the houses became too expensive to maintain, when property taxes and repair costs exceeded remaining wealth, they were sold to preservation societies, donated to avoid taxes, turned into museums, opened to paying tourists. They survived as architecture, but died as family seats. The very permanence the builders sought was achieved only by surrendering ownership, by admitting that private wealth could not sustain them. The buildings stand today because they were taken from the family. The human cost of the Vanderbilt trajectory is rarely calculated, but worth considering. Thousands of workers, servants, and craftsmen built their economic lives around Vanderbilt wealth. The construction boom in Newport and New York employed generations of specialized workers, stonemasons, marble carvers, plasterers, gilders. The households supported entire communities of domestic servants. When the mansions closed, when the spending stopped, those economic ecosystems collapsed. The gardeners at Biltmore found themselves unemployed in rural North Carolina. The household staff at the Breakers discovered their elaborate service skills worthless in the Depression economy. The craftsmanship communities in Newport simply disappeared when the building stopped. Fortunes at this scale create gravitational fields of economic dependency. When they collapse, the damage radiates far beyond the family itself. The Vanderbilts spent themselves into ordinary life. The people who had served them often fell into genuine poverty. Yet there is something almost democratically satisfying about the Vanderbilt collapse, something that affirms rather than contradicts American mythology. They prove that dynastic wealth is not inevitable in American capitalism, that concentration cannot survive incompetence across generations, that visibility without substance eventually reveals itself as performance. In an era of growing wealth inequality, when generational transfer of capital threatens to create permanent aristocracy, When billionaires pass fortunes to heirs through complex trust structures, the Vanderbilt story offers an accidental argument for hope. Sufficiently stupid heirs can destroy any fortune, given time and freedom to do so. Estate taxes help by forcing liquidation at each transfer. But entropy helps more. The universe tends toward distribution and disorder. Wealth concentrates temporarily through effort, violence, or luck, and then dissipates, unless constantly maintained through genuine capability. The Vanderbilts had wealth, they did not have capability. Physics did the rest. The comparison to European aristocracy is instructive and reveals what the Vanderbilts lacked. The British families whose daughters married Vanderbilt sons, the Marlboroughs, the Manchesters, survived largely intact. Their titles and estates still held centuries later despite generations of economic incompetence. They survived not through business acumen, not through adapting to capitalism or building new fortunes. British aristocracy was economically incompetent for generations, producing heirs who could not manage estates or generate income. They survived through institutional structure imposed by law. Primogeniture prevented fragmentation by forcing entire estates to single heirs. Entails prevented sale or subdivision of property across generations. Legal structures protected estates from individual foolishness by limiting what heirs could do with inherited wealth. The system assumed heirs would be incompetent and planned accordingly. The Vanderbilts, operating in American law without such protections, in a culture that celebrated individual freedom and opposed aristocratic structure, executed the democratic experiment. Let heirs do what they want with inheritance. Trust individual choice, and watch what happens. The experiment succeeded brilliantly at its implicit goal, preventing permanent dynasty. Some Vanderbilt descendants would later claim the dissolution was worth it, that the freedom to live without dynastic obligation, without pressure to preserve or perform, was more valuable than preserved wealth. This reframing contains some truth, but mostly serves as psychological comfort after the fact. Nobody raises children hoping they will be the generation that spends the fortune. Nobody builds a railroad empire to fund great-grandchildren's divorces and mansion maintenance. The Commodore would have been disgusted. Not because he valued family, he clearly did not, given his contemptuous treatment of most of his children, but because he valued winning, dominating, accumulating, and his heirs lost so thoroughly, so completely, that they eventually made poverty look like liberation rather than failure. The reframing is sophisticated but unconvincing. The mansions remain, standing as monuments to misunderstood wealth and failed legacy, their stone and marble outlasting the fortune that built them. Tourists walk through the breakers every summer by the thousands, shuffling through rooms roped off to protect floors and furnishings, admiring marble imported from Italian quarries and gold leaf applied by European craftsmen working from scaffolding, imagining the glamour of the Gilded Age, the elaborate parties and the gowns that cost fortunes. They stand in the great hall looking up at the coffered ceiling covered in gold and platinum, trying to comprehend the scale, the ambition, the sheer concentrated wealth required to build such a space for seasonal occupation. They rarely consider the economic mechanics that made such buildings unsustainable, or the psychological failures that prevented the builders from understanding what they were actually doing. The beauty is real and undeniable. The craftsmanship in the carved mantels, the precision of the marble inlay work, the paintings on the ceilings. The craftsmanship is extraordinary and historically significant, representing skills that barely exist today. But the economic logic was catastrophic. The assumptions fundamentally wrong. Marble House stands white against the ocean view, its yellow sienna marble ballroom still glowing in afternoon light. But now it belongs to the Preservation Society, maintained by admission fees and donations rather than family wealth. The Chinese tea house sits at the cliff edge, its elaborate carvings facing the Atlantic, a folly built for tea parties that happened perhaps a dozen times before the money ran out. Biltmore still operates as a tourist destination in the North Carolina mountains, but it is owned by descendants who learned to run it as a business rather than a residence, offering tours, hotel rooms, and winery tastings to generate the revenue needed to maintain the structure. The banquet hall, where George Vanderbilt barely entertained, now hosts thousands of visitors annually who pay admission to walk through rooms the family cannot afford to heat. The estate survives, but not as he intended, not as dynastic seat, but as commercial heritage attraction. These buildings have achieved the permanence their builders sought, but only by escaping family ownership, only by becoming public rather than private, only by transforming from homes into museums. Future generations might learn from this, or might not. History suggests that wealth, once achieved, creates its own mythology of permanence that blinds heirs to reality. Every generation of inheritors believes they are different, that their fortune is special, that entropy and taxes and human foolishness apply to other families, but not to them. The Vanderbilts believe this, walking through their marble halls, eating in their 60-foot dining rooms, sleeping in bedrooms with 14-foot ceilings, convinced that such material permanence reflected permanent wealth. They were wrong. The next dynasty believes it now, building their own monuments in glass and steel and rare woods, convinced their fortune will be different. The Vanderbilt curse, if such a thing exists, is not supernatural or mystical. It is structural and psychological. It is the belief that wealth is static rather than dynamic, that inheriting money means inheriting the capabilities that generated it, that social position can substitute for economic production. It is the psychology of the trust fund heir, written across 4 generations. The assumption that because you have always had money, you always will, that wealth is a permanent condition rather than a temporary advantage requiring constant defense. The curse is simply reality appearing slowly enough that each generation can convince themselves the problems will be solved by the next generation, the mistakes will be corrected, the bleeding will stop, until there are no generations left with problems worth solving, because there is no wealth left worth protecting, until the family name is famous and the family fortune is gone, until the mansions are museums and the descendants are ordinary. 1877 to 1973. 96 years from the largest personal fortune in American history to a family reunion of ordinary middle-class citizens. The Vanderbilts compressed the full cycle of dynastic rise and fall into less than a century, executing with remarkable efficiency what usually takes dynasties 3 centuries to accomplish. They built monuments that still stand, more permanent than the fortune that built them. They created museums from their own failure, turned their houses into public educational spaces, teaching lessons they never learned themselves. They proved that in America, at least, great wealth is temporary, that inheritance without capability is a slow-motion catastrophe, and that the mansions we build to announce our permanence often serve primarily as tombstones, marking where our fortunes died and our dynasties ended.